Have you ever wondered if a house could think, could remember you, and could dream about you? Stay tuned for The House That Dreams, a story so haunting you won't be able to have a good sleep tonight. Fair warning, some of these tales may haunt you long after you've heard them. Before we begin, I request you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. On that note, let's begin. The red wristband. Dr. Lee had always been practical. The whispers about St. Mercy's Hospital, the haunted floors, the unexplainable cold spots, and the lights that flickered even after being replaced were nothing more than urban legends to her. After all, hospitals weren't just places of healing. They were also places of death, and death left its mark. But on this night, something was different. The air itself felt charged, almost oppressive, as if the building was alive and watching. It was just past 3 a.m., the infamous witching hour, and the hospital was quieter than usual. Dr. Lee sat in the dimly lit break room, sipping lukewarm coffee and reviewing patient charts. A faint hum of the vending machine buzzed in the background, but the sound didn't comfort her the way it usually did. She felt oddly exposed, as though unseen eyes were on her. The hospital's wristband system was straightforward: green for the living, red for the dead. Patients who passed away were marked with the red wristbands until they were transferred to the morgue in the basement. It was a grim but necessary system. Her pager buzzed sharply, jolting her out of her thoughts. Room 408, patient expired. She sighed, gathering her things to confirm the death and notify the morgue staff. The hall stretched endlessly as she walked, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering at irregular intervals. She passed room after room of sleeping patients, their rhythmic breathing a steady reassurance that life still lingered here. Room 408 was at the far end of the corridor, near the fire escape. When Dr. Lee entered, she was met with the familiar, eerie stillness of death. The patient, an elderly woman with sunken cheeks and wispy hair, lay motionless on the bed. Dr. Lee checked her watch and noted the time of death, then methodically filled out the paperwork. The nurse on duty handed her a red wristband. Dr. Lee wrapped it around the woman's frail wrist, noting how cold the body had already become. Just as she was about to leave, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She turned and stared at the woman's face. It was still and lifeless, but something felt off. The eyes, they were open, and though clouded with death, they seemed to glint unnaturally in the dim light, as though they were watching her. Dr. Lee shook her head, blaming her exhaustion. "You're imagining things," she muttered to herself and walked out of the room. The elevator encounter. She decided to grab a coffee from the basement lounge before continuing her rounds. She stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the basement, and leaned against the cold metal wall. The doors began to close when a faint voice called out, "Wait." She hit the open door button, and a woman shuffled in, dressed in a hospital gown. She looked pale, almost translucent, with dark circles under her eyes. "Are you all right?" Dr. Lee asked, frowning. The woman didn't respond, simply staring at the floor. Her silence was unsettling, but Dr. Lee didn't press further. As the elevator descended, the lights flickered once, then twice. The woman turned her head slightly, her cracked lips twitching as if she wanted to speak. "Do you believe in curses?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dr. Lee blinked. "Excuse me?" The woman turned fully now, her bloodshot eyes locking onto Dr. Lee's. "The red wristbands," she said. "They don't just mark the dead. They invite something else." Dr. Lee's chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she raised her arm, and Dr. Lee's breath caught in her throat. Wrapped tightly around her wrist was a red band. Dr. Lee stumbled back, her heart pounding. "How? How did you?" Before she could finish her sentence, the elevator jolted violently, and the lights went out completely. The metal groaned, as though something heavy was pressing against it. In the darkness, Dr. Lee heard it, a dragging sound, like wet footsteps scraping across the elevator floor. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. Then the woman's voice came, raspy and distorted, as though it was coming from everywhere at once. "They don't like being forgotten. They want to be remembered. Always." Suddenly, the dragging stopped, replaced by a sharp, metallic scraping noise. The elevator doors creaked open slightly, revealing nothing but pitch blackness beyond. A hand emerged from the darkness, a skeletal hand with rotting flesh clinging to it. It grasped the edge of the door, forcing it open inch by inch. Dr. Lee backed into the corner, clutching her pager like it could somehow protect her. The thing that emerged wasn't human. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and around its wrist, a red band glowed faintly in the dim light. "You marked us," it rasped. "Now you'll join us." The climax. Dr. Lee pressed every button on the elevator's panel, desperate to escape, but the buttons didn't respond. The creature stepped closer, its decayed body bending and cracking with each unnatural movement. Suddenly, the woman from before stepped forward, her head twisting at an impossible angle to look directly at Dr. Lee. "You should have left," she whispered. The lights flickered on for a brief moment, and Dr. Lee saw them. Dozens of figures, all wearing red wristbands, their hollow eyes fixed on her. They reached out, their hands clawing at her skin, dragging her into the mass of writhing, decaying bodies. Her screams echoed through the elevator shaft, heard only by the janitor mopping the floor several stories above. When the elevator was found the next morning, it was empty. Dr. Lee's belongings were scattered on the floor, but there was no sign of her. The hospital staff reviewed the security footage, but all they saw was the elevator descending, empty. Still, some say they hear whispers in the basement at night, faint cries for help, and the sound of dragging footsteps. And occasionally, when the elevator doors open unexpectedly, a red wristband can be found lying on the floor, waiting for its next victim. The whispering. It started 2 weeks ago, on what seemed like an ordinary night. My 5-year-old daughter, Lily, padded into my room at 2 a.m., clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. Her wide eyes shimmered with tears as she shook me awake. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's someone under my bed." Groggy and half asleep, I chalked it up to a bad dream. Kids that age often have overactive imaginations. I pulled her into a hug, murmuring reassurances, and led her back to her room. Flicking on the light, I crouched down and peered under the bed. "See?" I said with a comforting smile. "There's no one there." She didn't seem convinced. Her tiny fingers clung to my arm like a lifeline. "But he hides when you look," she murmured, her voice barely audible. A chill prickled down my spine, but I brushed it off, tucked her in, and kissed her forehead. "You're safe, sweetheart. I promise." Yet, as I turned off the light and left her room, her words lingered in my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep, haunted by the faint unease that crept under my skin. The next night, it happened again. At precisely 2 a.m., Lily shook me awake, tears streaming down her face. "Daddy, he's under my bed again," she whimpered. "He keeps whispering my name." Her voice wavered, and for a fleeting moment, so did my composure. Still, I checked, lingering longer this time, my eyes scouring the dark void beneath her bed. There was nothing, just dust and a forgotten sock. I tried to reassure her, but my words fell hollow. As the days turned into nights, this routine became unnervingly consistent. Every night, she'd wake me, claiming the same thing. A man was under her bed, whispering her name. And every night, I'd find nothing but an empty space. Then, last night happened. It started differently. I didn't wake till Lily shaking me awake. Instead, I woke to the faint sound of her crying. My pulse quickened as I stumbled out of bed and down the hallway toward her room. But as I reached her door, I froze. The crying wasn't coming from her bed. It was coming from under it. "Daddy," her trembling voice whimpered, muffled and distant. "He's on top of my bed." My stomach dropped. Slowly, I pushed open the door. The dim glow of her nightlight painted the room in long, eerie shadows. My breath hitched as I saw Lily lying perfectly still on her bed, her back to me. Her stuffed rabbit was clutched tightly in her arms. "Lily?" I whispered, stepping closer. She didn't respond. Her mouth was moving, ever so slightly, but no sound came out. The faint crying was still coming from beneath her bed. I crouched down, my hands trembling as I reached for the bed frame. The moment my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I wished I hadn't looked. Two glinting eyes stared back at me, unblinking, and a wide, unnatural grin spread across a face that mirrored Lily's. It wasn't her. It couldn't be. The thing under the bed opened its mouth, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. "Daddy," it rasped, its voice a grotesque parody of Lily's. "Why don't you come closer?" I staggered back, my head spinning as the thing began to crawl out from under the bed, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. My instincts screamed at me to run, but when I turned toward the door, I froze. The Lily on the bed was now sitting up, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes completely black. "Why are you leaving me?" she asked, her voice layered with a guttural growl. Before I could react, both of them, Lily and her twisted doppelganger, lunged toward me. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out in the hallway, because I woke up to silence and the pale light of dawn creeping through the windows. When I cautiously opened Lily's door, the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, her stuffed rabbit resting on the pillow. But Lily was gone. Her laughter now haunts my dreams. Sometimes I hear it in the dead of night, soft, playful, and echoing from under my bed. The echo in the woods. They always warn people to stay out of Blackwood Forest after dark. It wasn't the usual small-town superstition about bears or wolves. It was something else, something darker. People who ventured into the forest at night often came back changed, or worse, they didn't come back at all. Mia didn't believe in the stories. She was a journalist, after all, a seeker of facts, not fairy tales. When her editor handed her a piece about the strange disappearances in Blackwood, she decided to investigate the forest herself. The idea of unraveling the mystery thrilled her more than it scared her. The locals didn't offer much help. "It's the echo," said an old man at the diner, his voice low and shaky. "The forest repeats what it hears, but not like you think. It'll mimic your voice, your thoughts. Then it'll try to take you." Mia had scoffed, jotting down his words in her notebook. Folklore. That's all it was. She parked her car at the edge of the forest, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Her flashlight cut a narrow path through the darkness as she ventured deeper into the woods. Her recorder was running, capturing every sound, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional rustle of a branch. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, just silence. Then she heard it, a faint whisper. It was so soft, she thought she'd imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Mia." She froze, her heart pounding. The voice was unmistakable. It was her own. "Mia." Her breath hitched. It was coming from deeper in the woods. Against her better judgment, she followed it, shining her flashlight into the trees. The beam caught movement, a shadow darting between the trunks. "Who's there?" she called out. But the only response was her own voice, echoing back at her. "Who's there?" It wasn't just repeating her words. The tone was wrong, mocking, almost playful. Her grip tightened on the flashlight as she pushed forward. The air grew colder, biting at her skin. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching for her. The whispering grew louder, overlapping now, like a chorus of voices all speaking in her tone. "Mia, this way, come closer." She broke into a run, her flashlight bouncing wildly. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together. Her own voice surrounded her, laughing, taunting. Then she saw it, a figure standing just ahead, shrouded in shadow. It looked like her, down to the smallest detail. Same hair, same clothes, same terrified expression. "Who are you?" Mia demanded, her voice shaking. The figure smiled, a grotesque, twisted grin. "I'm you." Before she could react, the figure lunged at her. She screamed, stumbling backward, but there was nothing behind her. She fell hard, the flashlight slipping from her grasp and skittering across the ground. Darkness enveloped her. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on the forest floor. The flashlight was dead, and her recorder was gone. The trees were still, the silence oppressive. She tried to stand, but her body felt wrong, heavy, like it didn't quite belong to her. She stumbled back to her car, her thoughts racing. When she reached the edge of the forest, she climbed into the driver's seat and caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face stared back at her, but her eyes weren't hers. They were black, empty like a void. And then she smiled, but she didn't want to. The smile stretched wider, impossibly wide, splitting her face in a way no human face could move. As she screamed, her voice echoed unnaturally in her ears, mocking her. The next day, the locals found her car abandoned by the forest's edge. They searched for Mia, but no one ever saw her again. Sometimes, though, if you stand at the edge of Blackwood Forest after dark, you can hear her voice calling out. But it's not really her. It's the echo. The house that dreams. The house on Old Willow Lane had been empty for decades. Locals whispered that it was cursed. They said it dreamed about those who entered it. And if the house dreamed of you long enough, you'd never leave. Lila didn't believe in curses or haunted houses. She was an architect who loved exploring abandoned buildings, photographing their decayed beauty, and imagining what they'd once been like. When she learned about the Willow House, she couldn't resist. She packed her gear and headed out one misty autumn morning, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound as she approached. The house loomed at the end of a crooked path. Its shutters hung like broken wings, and the roof sagged under years of neglect. Yet, there was something oddly inviting about it. Lila felt a tug in her chest, a strange, compelling urge to step inside. The front door creaked open with barely a push. The air inside was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mold and rotting wood. Dust hung in the beams of sunlight that sliced through the broken windows. She set up her camera and began exploring. Each room felt wrong. The wallpaper peeled in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost like faces, their hollow eyes watching her. The wood creaked under her boots, but the sound was more than an echo. It was as if the house were sighing, shifting, aware of her presence. Then she found the journal. It was lying on a small, dust-covered table in what must have once been a study. Its leather cover was cracked with age, the pages yellowed. Curious, Lila opened it. June 15th, 1973. The house dreams again. It remembers us now. I see it in the walls, in the mirrors. I hear it in the whispers when the wind passes through the cracks. The longer we stay, the harder it becomes to leave. It's dreaming of me every night. I'm afraid that soon I won't wake up. Lila frowned. The entries continued, each one more frantic than the last. The writer, a woman named Eleanor, described hearing her name whispered in the halls. her reflection moving when she wasn't. And then, abruptly, the journal ended. A soft sound broke the silence. Lila. She froze. The voice had come from the hall behind her. Slowly, she turned, her heart hammering in her chest. The hallway was empty, but the air felt charged, alive. She forced a laugh. It had to be the wind. Still, her legs trembled as she walked back to the main room. Lila. This time it was louder, closer. She spun around, her camera clattering to the floor. The house was silent again, but she could feel it. Something watching her, pressing in around her. She needed to leave. She ran for the door, but the hallway stretched impossibly long, twisting and turning in ways it hadn't before. Panic clawed at her chest as she sprinted, the house groaning around her. And then she saw herself. Her own reflection stood in the cracked glass of a tall, antique mirror at the end of the hallway. But it wasn't copying her movements. It was smiling. Her reflection raised a hand and waved, its grin widening until the corners of its mouth cracked open, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many. Lila screamed, stumbling backward, but the mirror shattered, and the shards spilled out onto the floor, each one reflecting that same grotesque smile. The walls began to pulse, the wood groaning as if the house were breathing. "It's dreaming of you," whispered a dozen voices, overlapping, echoing. Lila ran blindly, her vision blurring with tears. The wall shifted, closing in, trapping her. Doors appeared and disappeared, leading nowhere. She tripped, falling hard onto the splintered floor. When she looked up, she was back in the study. The journal lay open on the table, but the words had changed. "It remembers you now, Lila. You're part of its dream." The room darkened, the shadows stretching toward her, reaching out with long, clawed fingers. She screamed as they enveloped her. The next morning, the house was quiet again. The dust lay undisturbed, the air heavy and still. Lila's car remained parked on the crooked path, her belongings untouched. Inside, the journal now rested on the small table, its leather cover pristine, as if brand new. On the first page, in Lila's handwriting, was a single sentence. "The house dreams again, and now it dreams of you." The midnight game. It started as a dare. It always does. Sam, Lauren, and Tyler had heard the legend from a thread on an urban myth forum. The midnight game, they called it, an old pagan ritual used as punishment for those who defied their gods. The game was supposed to summon something ancient and malevolent. The Midnight Man. The rules were simple. Write your full name on a piece of paper. Prick your finger and let a drop of blood fall onto the paper. Place the paper outside your front door. At exactly midnight, knock on the door 22 times. The final knock must land precisely at 12 a.m. Once the ritual was complete, you had to stay in your house with all the lights off, carrying only a single candle for light. The Midnight Man would enter. The goal? Survive until 3:33 a.m. without being caught. The rules came with warnings. Never let your candle go out. Never stand in one place for too long. And under no circumstances should you try to leave the house. It was ridiculous, Sam thought. Just another spooky story to scare teenagers. Still, it was Friday night, and they were bored. What's the worst that could happen? Tyler said, grinning as he handed out the slips of paper. Lauren hesitated. "I don't know. What if it's real?" Sam rolled his eyes. "Come on, you're not scared, are you?" Reluctantly, Lauren took the paper and pricked her finger. They followed the instructions, performing the ritual to the letter. The door was knocked on exactly 22 times, with the last knock falling precisely at midnight. When they closed the door and blew out the lights, the house fell into an oppressive silence. They lit their candles, the tiny flames flickering weakly against the darkness. For the first 15 minutes, nothing happened. They sat in the living room, trying to laugh off the tension. Then, A soft knock came from the back of the house. Everyone froze. "Did you hear that?" Lauren whispered. Sam tried to laugh, but it came out shaky, probably just the wind. The knocking came again, louder this time, and then footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving closer. "Someone's messing with us," Tyler said, his voice cracking. He stood, clutching his candle. "Don't." Lauren grabbed his arm. "You're not supposed to." But Tyler was already moving toward the sound, his candlelight barely piercing the darkness. "Hello," he called. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. A low, guttural whisper drifted from the shadows, too faint to make out the words. Tyler took a step back, his candle flickering violently. "Tyler, get back here," Sam hissed. But before Tyler could turn, his candle went out. The room plunged into silence. "Light it," Lauren whispered frantically. Tyler fumbled with his lighter, but his hands were trembling. The whisper grew louder, closer, filling the room with a sound like nails dragging across stone. In the faint glow of their candles, Sam and Lauren saw it. A shadow, impossibly tall and thin, standing just behind Tyler. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes were hollow voids, darker than the surrounding blackness. "Tyler moved," Sam shouted, but Tyler couldn't. The shadow reached out, its fingers elongating into sharp, claw-like points. The last thing they heard was Tyler's scream as the darkness swallowed him. The air grew colder. Sam grabbed Lauren's hand, pulling her toward the hallway. "We have to keep moving." "But Tyler, he's gone," Sam snapped, his voice shaking. "The rules. They had to follow the rules." They ran through the house, their candles casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. The whispers followed them, growing louder, more insistent. "Why do we do this?" Lauren sobbed. "Just stay with me," Sam said. But even he was struggling to keep his fear at bay. Suddenly, Lauren stopped. "Sam," her voice was barely a whisper. He turned, and his blood ran cold. The hallway in front of them stretched longer than it should have, the walls bending inward like a twisted funhouse. At the end of the hall, a door stood ajar, revealing a black void beyond. A figure stepped out from the void. It was Tyler. "Guys, it's me," Tyler said, his voice calm, too calm. "Don't," Lauren said, pulling Sam back. "That's not him." Tyler smiled, but it was all wrong. His teeth were too white, too sharp. His eyes reflected nothing, just empty darkness. "Come on," he said, stepping closer. "It's safe. You can stop running now." Sam didn't wait. He pulled Lauren into the nearest room and slammed the door. "We have to keep the candles lit," he said, his voice shaking. But Lauren wasn't listening. She was staring at the walls, her face pale. Sam followed her gaze. The walls were covered in writing, names, hundreds of them, carved deep into the wood. At the very bottom, fresh and dripping with blood, were their names. Sam Carter, Lauren May. The door creaked open behind them. They turned slowly, their candles flickering in the icy air. The midnight man stood in the doorway, his impossibly tall frame filling the space. His hollow eyes locked onto them, and his mouth twisted into a grin that split his face. The candles went out. The next morning, the house was quiet again. The police found 3 candles melted to stubs on the living room floor. No sign of Tyler, Sam, or Lauren was ever found. The locals didn't need to guess what happened. The house on Willow Lane claimed another 3 names, and the midnight game continues to wait. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.